My name's Matt Tischer, and today we are going to talk about attacking people using flash drives. So the anecdote we're looking at here is actually one that hopefully lots of people in this room have seen before. It is one where it's relatively simple to actually attack an organization just by taking a bunch of commodity USB flash drives, putting something bad on them, going to the parking lot, scattering them somewhere, and waiting until participants pick up the drives, plug them into their computers, and you've successfully compromised everyone without breaking a sweat. The quote shown on this slide actually typifies what we see in these sort of anecdotes. Everything is effective. 15 out of the 20 drives were actually picked up. And it's not hard to make the attack work. They didn't even need to break a sweat. In fact, this particular anecdote has gotten popular enough that it's actually made its way onto TV in the case of the show Mr. Robot. Now, when we wanted to investigate this particular anecdote, we had a couple questions we wanted to answer. First of all, we wanted to see whether this attack actually did work. Do users really plug in USB drives that they find? And if they do, what is that percentage? Is it 5%, 50%, more? We also wanted to see if we could make the attack more effective by modifying the appearance of the drives, where they were placed, or when they were placed. If we write interesting things on the drive, will that convince people to plug them in? Is dropping things in the cafeteria just as good as the parking lot? Is there a good time to do this? Finally, we were interested in getting inside people's minds and figuring out why they actually pick up these drives and open files. Are there particular demographics who fall for this attack more? Are people actually just bad at security? Are these the people who don't understand it well? Why do they even want to do this? So in order to test all of this, we devised and executed the following experiment. We dropped, photographed, and geolocated 297 flash drives at the University of Illinois. Drives were dropped over 3 days, with the majority of the drives being dropped during the Monday and Tuesday of the week before finals. We dropped in 30 different locations, dropped 5 different kinds of drives, and during 2 times of day. Morning from 6 to 10 a.m. in order to attack participants as they came to work or school, and 1 to 5 p.m. afternoon to attack participants as they left school or work. We also periodically revisited these locations after we dropped drives to informally see whether participants were picking up these drives and moving them. We recorded when users opened files on the flash drives, what files they opened and when they opened. Finally, when users double-clicked on these files, we presented them with a survey to allow them to express information about themselves and why they fell for the attack in the first place. Naturally, this particular experiment earns a slide for ethics on its own. As it happens, dropping a bunch of flash drives on a university campus to convince participants that they are something innocuous was something that we got approved by our institutional review board. We worked with various stakeholders, including campus police, legal counsel, and technology services at Illinois. We incorporated their feedback as we went. And in terms of the technical setup of the experiment, we made sure that we never actually executed code on users' systems unless they double-clicked on what ultimately was an HTML file on the flash drive. As a result, we are not able to track when users plug in the flash drives, which is a way to compromise them. But we did want to ensure that the only way we would load our remote image tag from our server was one where users had explicitly made a choice. So now we will address whether users actually do this. First, we dropped 297 flash drives on the ground. Among those, 290 were taken from the ground by the Friday of that week. And finally, in terms of the events we detected on our own servers, 135 drives reported that files were opened. As a result, if we conservatively estimate that users who opened files on the drives of their own volition would have been compromised, we can lower bound the effectiveness of this attack at 45%. As mentioned before, we did not track flash drives that could have been plugged into computers without file opens. As a result, the true effectiveness of this attack is most likely somewhere between 45 and 98%. There's also an interesting note here about speed. This attack works quickly. The graph shown here demonstrates the cumulative distribution function of the times between when we dropped drives and when drives were plugged in and files were opened. We noticed that drives in afternoon were picked up and plugged in more frequently, but for the group as a whole, the median time between drop and file open was 6.9 hours. We also noticed online via monitoring social media that people did begin to discuss this on Reddit during Tuesday afternoon when we were dropping the large majority of the last of our drives. Now we ask, can we increase the effectiveness of this attack in any particular way? We use 5 types of drives to provide a variety for users to pick from. Drives in the upper left corner were unlabeled as a control. Some drives were labeled confidential or final exam solutions to attempt to appeal to participants' self-interest. Some drives had keys or return labels attached in order to attempt to appeal to participants' motivation. Oh, that's somebody's apartment keys. I'd better plug it in and see if I can return it to them. We also make another timing note in the sense that these drives were once again dropped the week before finals. So we did happen to observe making at least one student very happy and likely later very sad. Now, we chose realistic contents for these drives as well. What you see here are the contents we used for unlabeled, return label, and keys drives. As you can tell, there's a set of documents including a resume, some math notes, and some winter break pictures. We dropped in 30 locations across the Illinois campus, divided into 5 different kinds of categories. Academic rooms, like classrooms or libraries, common rooms, like cafeterias or halls and dorms, hallways, outside pathways, walkways, and benches, and parking lots. Now we ask, well, can we actually increase the effectiveness of this attack at all? Interestingly enough, the answer is no. We can't actually increase the effectiveness of the attack by changing how the drive looks like, where we dropped it, or what time of day it was. However, we can actually decrease the effectiveness of this attack by attaching a return label to the drive. So the net takeaway from this may in fact be, if you don't want people snooping through your flash drives, provide them an alternate way of contacting you. Now we ask the third question. Why are people doing this? We'll hop back to our previously mentioned attack funnel, and we'll consider the 62 survey responses we received from participants who plugged in drives and double-clicked on files. We find a couple interesting things. Now, this survey was comprised of a couple different components. First, we included the domain-specific risk-taking scale, which describes participants' willingness to pursue risky activities across 5 different domains, such as financial or recreational. Are you willing to go skydiving? Are you willing to make an investment that's 10% of your income if it's risky? We also included the security behavior intention scale, which measures participants' frequency of various positive or negative security behaviors. Are participants likely to frequently install updates? Are they likely to frequently change their passwords? We also wanted to know who are these people who are falling for this attack. So we asked various demographic questions, such as their age, gender, and affiliation with the University of Illinois. Are undergraduates more likely to fall for this than graduate students? Are professors the most likely of all? We also asked various questions about the flash drive itself. Did you notice anything special about it? Were you interested in it for any particular reason? Why did you plug it in? Did you have any concerns about the entire thing? We find a few interesting findings. The vast majority of participants claimed they wanted to return the drive to its proper owner. Now, this makes sense and is in line with the data we have that say return label drives are opened less often, but there's a caveat to this. Remember how we said we tracked which files were opened when participants plugged in drives? It turns out that many of them actually chose to look at winter break photos first. And we argue that while a resume, for example, may contain contact information of the owner, and while one person in the survey made the defense that they were looking for the owner on Facebook, we find that most likely participants are also driven by curiosity. The vast majority of participants also did not describe taking precautions, and while some of them, in fact, did do very well, opening the HTML file in a text editor on a virtual machine without network access, other participants were less good at this. For example, when one participant was asked, were you concerned about what could be on the flash drive? They said, yes, I was. So I sacrificed a university computer. This slide was very popular with our IT department. We also find that there actually isn't really any particular type of participant when we compare to the University of Illinois population. They're demographically similar in terms of gender, affiliation, and age. And when we look at their security behavior intentions, for the majority of items, they're actually similar to the general University of Illinois population. To summarize, we find that users do in fact plug in USB flash drives that they find on the ground. From 45 to 98% is a rough estimate of our success rate. You can't really make the attack much better by changing the appearance of the drive, where you drop it or when you drop it, but if you don't want people snooping through your stuff, it's probably not a bad idea to attach a return label. And finally, participants do claim that they pick up drives to return them, and there is a lot of evidence that suggests this, but there is also some suggestion that curiosity plays a significant role in their interest. That concludes this talk. Thank you very much for your time, and now any questions?
Hi, really interesting talk. I guess it's a fairly common practice to use predominantly undergraduate populations as a proxy for actual adults. The thing that I'm curious in this case, the scenarios, the environments where like social engineering attacks via USB actually worry us are enterprises and government facilities where we have security training and security interventions, and at this point, people talk about social engineering and what those attacks might look like. So I was curious, do you have a sense, with these findings, is there anything that we can take from these results and apply to them to some of these environments that we care about the most in this regard?
Sure. I think one of the more interesting results that comes out of this is we did, in fact, in terms of the context of the study itself, we did actually see graduate students and staff picking up these drives as well. So in a somewhat limited context of the university kind of as a quote-unquote corporate environment, we do actually still see a little bit of compromise. In addition, I'd also say, I think it's interesting to note that motivation for people on this does not really appear to be pegged to anything particular. So I think it's still useful to potentially educate people and say, any of this is potentially dangerous. But otherwise, I guess the main takeaway is probably just to, consider it a threat in the first place.
Thanks. Yeah, Ellie Canal, Software Engineering Institute. A very interesting talk. So to think of this, I'm trying to think of this more from a behavioral economics standpoint. If you have like a dollar on the floor, most people will pick it up because they won't assume the dollar is coated with, Ebola virus or something like that. So to that standpoint, it seems that most people would pick up a USB because they simply, to them, I may get to see something cool, and the downside is I'm wasting 5 minutes. They don't realize that I may be ruining my life. So do you ask questions about what their background is, what kind of risks they associate with putting a USB drive in their computer?
We didn't really go down that road too much. One of the interesting things we actually did find along those directions, though, was that a decent chunk of participants actually double-clicked on the files because they saw they were HTML files. So the fact that the drive looked a little bit suspicious was actually something interesting that they were looking for. So,
cool, thank you.
So was the fact that you didn't go to Walmart, say, and put out drives saying store number such and such layoffs, or outside Apple and say put other drives there because of the IRB or what?
So yeah, I think it was something we were a little hesitant to go into, in part because we wanted to make sure we engaged with all of our stakeholders appropriately. And when you go to Walmart, it's not strictly speaking just that Walmart. It's potentially someone higher up the chain as well. And in terms of risk, keeping things relatively isolated to the university was something that sort of allowed us to easily make sure the proper stakeholders were being contacted and everything was coordinated as best as possible.
Do you think there'll be serious issues about trying to do a study on a industrial campus or such?
I don't think there are serious issues in terms of things ethically speaking. I think it may take a while unless there are the proper contacts in place to make sure the right people are aware of things. So there might be red tape, I would expect, but I wouldn't expect it to be ultimately insurmountable.
Hi, good afternoon. I have a question regarding your survey that you got with the files. Did you get information about whether they were using their personal computers or university computers? I know the one joke came up about the IT staff, but when you come into, say, a corporate work environment, if they would pick up the USB drive and, say, plug it into a work computer versus their home computer?
We did not do any significant tracking. We actually chose not to retain IP addresses, for example, because we consider them identifiable information. So essentially, our information in terms of where people plug things in is limited to what they supplied to us themselves when we asked them about it.
And on a related note, so you said that somewhere between 45 and 98% of the drives were maybe used. For your more tech-savvy folk who may not have plugged it into an internet-connected device, was there anything in there that allowed them to communicate to you that they found it and didn't plug it into a computer that would be compromised?
Yes, and actually, I think one or two participants, since it was an HTML file, we included the debriefing page in HTML, and we included a contact email information for us for the entire study. And what we did find actually with a couple of the very tech-savvy people is they emailed us to say, is this actually a legitimate survey or is somebody putting your name on their own attack? So.
Okay, cool. That was all I have. Thank you.
Sorry, we're actually,
Really quick.
Okay,
Does
really
the
quick, go for
University
it.
of Illinois conduct annual security training for faculty, staff, and students?
I forget exactly the protocols in place, but I believe there is some regular security component.